The Argonians come from Black Marsh, a swampy, hostile land that outsiders rarely understand and even more rarely respect. But to the Dunmer, the neighboring dark elves of Morrowind Black Marsh wasn't just a strange land, it was a resource. For centuries, Dunmer raiders crossed the border not for trade or diplomacy, but for people. Argonians were captured, chained, and dragged from their homes to serve as slaves. This wasn't a rogue act or something condemned by Dunmer society. It was law, culture, and business. Entire great houses like Dres built their wealth on Argonian slavery, with slave catchers patrolling the borders and keeping a steady supply of captives. These raids didn't stop at the edges of the province either. In the cities of Morrowind, Argonians were everywhere, but never as citizens or guests. They worked the hardest, most brutal jobs. They were miners, cleaners, and field laborers. They built the roads and kept the cities running. Yet they were denied even the most basic dignity. They were property. What made it worse was how normal it all was. Even noble and spiritual Dunmer saw no problem with the system. It was justified through ancient customs, religious doctrine, and sheer habit. The tribunal temple, the state religion, offered no real protest. Many of its followers believed slavery was part of the natural order, and Argonians, along with Khajiit, were simply born into their place, and that place was below everyone else. An Argonian born in Morrowind was not just a slave in chains. They were a person growing up in a world where their name, their voice, and their culture meant nothing. They were trained from childhood to obey, to fear punishment, and to never imagine freedom. Families were torn apart, sold to different households or mines, never to see each other again. Whole generations of Argonians grew up knowing no life outside of Morrowind's borders, no home outside of their Dunmer master's walls. Even those who escaped found no safe haven. Argonians were seen as dangerous and untrustworthy by many outside their homeland. In Morrowind, they were always watched, always one step away from violence. At the time of the events in Morrowind, slavery was still legal, and house dress still held power. Though some voices pushed for reform, especially under imperial pressure, nothing had truly changed for the Argonians on the ground. They were still working the plantations, still chained in the fields, still punished for speaking out. And while the rest of Tamriel moved slowly toward progress, Morrowind remained locked in old habits. For the Argonians, the chains weren't just iron. They were cultural, systemic, generational. They weren't allowed to speak their language, follow their traditions, or learn their history. Over time, many of them forgot the old ways, not because they wanted to, but because their masters never allowed them to remember. Their stories were erased, and their customs were treated as primitive or dangerous. Even their gods were mocked. What Morrowind took from the Argonians wasn't just labor, it was identity. When you look at Argonians during this time, you see a people stripped of more than just freedom. You see a history broken apart, a culture silenced, and a future stolen. That's why being an Argonian in Morrowind was more than just hard. It was dehumanizing, and for many it was inescapable. The great houses of Morrowind weren't just political factions. They were families with power passed down for generations, and each one controlled parts of the land, the economy, and the people. Argonians were part of that control. House Dres, in particular, built its fortune on slavery. Their plantations stretched across the Deshaan, worked entirely by Khajiit and Argonians under guard. But it wasn't just Dres. House Lalu, known for dealing with the Empire, also kept slaves. So did House Indoril and House Telvanni. Each justified it differently: tradition, religion, economic need, but all agreed on one thing: Argonians were not citizens, they were property. Morrowind's legal system didn't just allow this, it upheld it. The law didn't recognize Argonians as people with rights. They couldn't own land, file complaints, or defend themselves. They were recorded in ledgers like livestock, passed down in wills, bought and sold in markets, and punished without trial. If a slave tried to escape, the punishment wasn't just recapture. It could be death, and no court in Morrowind would call that murder. The temple, the central religious institution in Dunmer life, also helped keep the system in place. While it taught morality and spiritual duty, it never spoke against slavery. In fact, some used its texts to justify the treatment of Argonians. The idea was that every race had its place, and the Argonians' place was at the bottom. If a Dunmer followed the law, tithed to the temple, and cared for their slaves without unnecessary cruelty. They were seen as good and just. The system didn't need to be hidden, because it wasn't challenged from within. The Telvanni, isolated and obsessed with magical power, treated slaves like tools. To them, owning 100 Argonians was no different from owning 100 books. They saw life in terms of strength and control. A Telvanni wizard might experiment on a slave just to see what would happen. No one would stop them. Halalu masters were more pragmatic. They cared about profits and deals. If a slave was useful, they might be given food, clothes, or even small freedoms, but only because it made them more valuable. It wasn't kindness, it was business. For many Argonians, the mines were the worst. Deep underground, packed with others in the dark, they spent their lives digging raw materials for a society that didn't see them. Food was rationed, rest was short, and the air itself was dangerous to breathe. Accidents were common, lives were short, and replacements were easy to find. On plantations, the days were long and hot. Overseers with whips made sure no one slowed down. If someone got sick or injured, they kept working until they collapsed. Argonian children were born into it. They never got to choose another life. Some were taken from their parents to be raised in Dunmer households, trained to serve at tables or clean halls, made to feel like part of the family while still being treated as property. This wasn't an illegal secret. It was life. And while outsiders like the Empire sometimes spoke against it, the truth is that very little changed. The Empire signed treaties and passed rules, but they didn't want to provoke a rebellion, so they let Morrowind keep its system, and the Argonians kept suffering. There were slave hunters too. If an Argonian managed to run, they were hunted like animals. If they were caught, they were punished in ways meant to scare others. Morrowind didn't want slaves who obeyed, it wanted slaves who feared. Even those who stayed quiet and did what they were told weren't safe. One wrong word, one slow day, one mistake, and the punishment would come. The law was never on their side. Morrowind's society worked because it kept Argonians at the bottom. Every house, every court, every temple made sure they stayed there. And even when cracks began to form, the system held. The truth is, Argonians were never meant to rise in Morrowind. They were meant to serve, suffer, and disappear without a trace. But some didn't. Some remembered where they came from, who they were, and what was taken from them. And eventually, the story would change. But during the time of Morrowind, that change hadn't come yet. Argonian identity comes from more than their homeland or their appearance. It comes from the Hist, the living trees that grow in Black Marsh, and from the deep connection Argonians share with them. The Hist don't just guide Argonians, they shape them, they give them memories, instincts, even voices. Every Argonian is born tied to these ancient trees, and through them to the land and the soul of their people. But in Morrowind, none of that mattered. Dunmer society didn't only enslave Argonian bodies, it tried to erase what made them Argonian in the first place. Cultural practices, tribal names, spiritual beliefs, none of these were respected. Some were banned outright. Others were slowly stripped away by years of silence and punishment. Dunmer masters didn't want slaves with stories or songs or a sense of belonging. They wanted workers who obeyed. When an Argonian tried to speak their language or perform a ritual, they were mocked. When they spoke of the Hist, they were ignored. The Dunmer, with their worship of the tribunal and centuries of their own history, saw Argonian traditions as backward. They believed their gods were greater, their culture more refined, their laws more advanced. They didn't ask questions about Argonian beliefs. They didn't care. Over time, many Argonians grew up far from Black Marsh and the Hist. Born on plantations or in the mines, raised among other slaves, they never heard the voices of the trees. They never felt the call of their homeland. Without that link, something vital was missing. It was more than just exile. It was spiritual disconnection. The Hist shaped Argonian eggs, guiding how each hatchling grew. But in Morrowind, the Hist couldn't reach them. Some slaves were even forbidden to lay eggs or raise young, a cruel method of cutting off future generations from their roots. Dunmer households often renamed their slaves, giving them short, simple names easier for the masters to remember. Tribal names and personal names were tossed aside. Identity was reduced to a role: cook, cleaner, miner, guard. Names weren't the only thing lost. Clothing, too, changed. Argonian dress had once reflected tribe, region, and status. But in Morrowind, most wore what they were given, usually rags. Sometimes Dunmer-made garments with no meaning. Even speech patterns shifted. Young Argonians started speaking like their captors, losing their old words. This wasn't by chance, it was control. Dunmer nobles and priests believed their culture was superior, and that forcing others to conform was a gift. They never saw the damage they caused, they never cared. Stories from the marshlands faded. Dances were forgotten. Rites tied to the moons or the swamps were no longer performed. And without the Hist, there was no one to remember them. A culture that had lasted for ages began to weaken, not because of time, but because of force. This loss wasn't always visible. The mines and plantations kept running. The masters stayed wealthy. But beneath that, something deep and important was being broken. Argonian history isn't just something told in books. It lives in memories, in instinct, in rituals passed down through generations. When those links are cut, the damage doesn't show right away. But over time, it spreads. And even those who resisted felt it. Some tried to keep the old ways alive in secret. A whispered song here, a carved totem hidden in a bed of straw. But it was never easy. Overseers watched for signs of rebellion, and anything they didn't understand was treated as a threat. Cultural domination isn't loud. It doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with silence, with the slow grinding down of pride, with years of being told your gods aren't real. Your language doesn't matter. Your stories are foolish. Argonians weren't just made to work, they were made to forget, but not all of them did. In small ways, the culture endured. The bond with the Hist couldn't be fully severed. It waited, patient, like the roots of a tree buried deep in the swamp. And one day, that bond would call them home again. But during the height of Morrowind's rule, those roots were hidden, and the people they once nurtured were scattered across a land that saw no value in who they truly were. For years, Argonians lived in silence under Dunmer rule. Their chains were physical and cultural, but resistance never fully died. Even while forced into labor and treated as lesser beings, there were always moments when the spirit of rebellion surfaced. Sometimes it was quiet, a small act of defiance, an escape attempt, or a hidden ceremony held in secret. Other times, it boiled over into open conflict. Rebellions rose and fell throughout the years, most of them crushed before they could spread. But each one left a mark. Each one proved that the will to fight was still there. The Dunmer knew this, which is why their slave laws were so harsh and their punishments so extreme. They feared what would happen if the Argonians ever stood together, not just as slaves, but as a people with a common cause. That fear became real when the Oblivion Crisis shook Tamriel. While most provinces struggled to defend their cities from Daedric invasions, Black Marsh stood apart. The Daedra invaded, but they were driven back. The Argonians didn't just survive the crisis, they pushed back with such strength that even the invading forces couldn't keep their ground. Some say the Hist foresaw the event and prepared their people, guiding their minds and bodies for war. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. The Argonians were no longer seen as passive victims. They were warriors, shaped by centuries of suffering, now turned loose. With the Empire weakened and Morrowind reeling from its own battles, the time to act had come. Southern Morrowind, once the heart of the slaver economy, found itself vulnerable. Argonian forces crossed the border, not as raiders, but as an army. They didn't just want revenge. They wanted freedom, justice, and a message sent to every corner of Tamriel that their people would never be owned again. The invasion changed everything. Towns were taken, outposts fell. Dunmer nobles fled north. The centuries of control were broken in a matter of weeks. The Argonians seized the land their ancestors had been dragged through in chains, but it wasn't a clean victory. The fighting was brutal. Old anger mixed with new power, and the violence left scars. Some Dunmer civilians were caught in the path of the advancing army. Homes burned. Families were torn apart. The same brutality that had once been used against the Argonians now echoed back in reverse. And while many saw it as long overdue justice, others saw it as a new cycle of pain. The roots of hatred ran deep. Even after the conflict settled and borders were redrawn, the wounds didn't heal. Dunmer refugees blamed Argonians for their suffering. Argonians remembered the centuries of slavery and saw no reason to forgive. Southern Morrowind changed hands, but peace never fully took hold. For some, it was a victory. For others, a reminder that freedom often comes with a price. The Hist had guided their people, but they couldn't erase what had been done. The past couldn't be undone. The invasion didn't erase the memory of chains. It didn't rebuild the lost culture. It didn't bring back the Argonians who had died in mines or on plantations. But it did give the survivors something they had been denied for generations: a voice, a sense of control over their own fate, and a place to stand where they were no longer bowed under the weight of another's rule. In the end, the rebellion was more than a military event. It was the breaking of a pattern. For too long, the Argonians had been seen as nothing more than tools, bodies to be worked, lives to be owned. But the Oblivion Crisis and the invasion that followed showed the world a different truth. They were a people with history, strength, and purpose. A people that had been quiet, not weak. And when the time came, they didn't just fight, they won. Still, victory didn't mean peace. The hate didn't vanish. The stories didn't end. It just moved into a new chapter, one where the roles were no longer as clear and where every side carried pain that wouldn't easily fade. Slavery ended, but the chains didn't fall away completely. The laws changed, but hearts didn't. Even after being legally freed, Argonians in Morrowind weren't welcomed into society. They were pushed to the edges of it. In cities like Vivec, they were allowed in, but only barely. Most ended up in the canals and underworks, hidden beneath the towering cantons where the Dunmer walked freely. These areas were damp, narrow, and crumbling, far from the clean stone walkways above. They weren't meant to be homes. They were dark places made for sewage, storage, or forgotten corners of the city, but they became the neighborhoods Argonians were expected to live in. The locals called them lower waste works, or underworks, but they might as well have called them cages with plumbing. Above them, merchants sold fine robes and rare spices. Below, Argonians shared rooms with mold, rats, and the sound of dripping water. Freed, but still far from equal. Dunmer shopkeepers wouldn't hire them unless the job was dangerous, disgusting, or both. Guards looked the other way when they were cheated or beaten. And when something went wrong in town, when a cart was stolen or a window broken, it didn't take long for fingers to point toward the canal levels. Argonians became the go-to scapegoat for anything bad that happened, even without proof. Some tried to escape it. A few Argonians found work as scouts, hunters, or dockhands. Others joined temples or signed on with outlander factions, like the Fighters Guild, where they might earn some respect, but most never made it that far. They were stuck in a system that had no room for them at the top, only just enough space at the bottom to keep them quiet. Their names were often left off the records, their complaints ignored, their voices silenced before they could rise. The stigma of being a slave lingered like a brand. Even younger Argonians, born after abolition, grew up feeling the weight of it. Dunmer neighbors kept their distance. Their children were warned not to play with lizard folk. Dunmer priests preached compassion, but rarely practiced it when Argonians came knocking. The temple claimed to serve all, but some shrines refused Argonian pilgrims outright. And if an Argonian showed too much pride or too much ambition, the whispers started again, reminders of what they used to be. It wasn't just about where they lived. It was about how they were seen. Not as citizens, not as equals, but as reminders of a past most Dunmer didn't want to face. The old slavers had lost their power, but their attitudes still lingered. The great houses adjusted their language, not their values. Official documents stopped calling them property, but never quite started treating them like people either. And so Argonians lived in the shadows, not by choice, but because that's where they were pushed. Those who spoke out risked punishment. Those who stayed quiet learned to survive, day by day. Some formed small communities, watching out for one another, creating tiny safe spaces amid the grime and darkness. They kept their customs alive in secret, their food, their songs, their worship of the Hist, small acts of resistance in a world that barely noticed they were there. But they noticed. They remembered. Every dirty glance, every refusal, every door that didn't open when it should have. The racism wasn't loud anymore. It had become quiet, casual, and constant. A joke here, a slur there. A guard who took a little longer to respond when an Argonian called for help. A landlord who suddenly raised the rent when the tenant had scales. These things added up, not to a single moment of cruelty, but to a lifetime of being told they didn't belong. Even the Argonians who stayed in Black Marsh weren't free from it. Travelers and traders brought stories home about how their people were still seen as lesser, no matter where they went, about how Dunmer nobles still spoke of them like cattle, about how the world forgot who had built its roads and farms with their blood. And so the struggle continued, not with swords, but with stubbornness, not with armies, but with memory. Because being free didn't mean being accepted. Being legal didn't mean being welcome. And for the Argonians who lived in Morrowind, after the chains were broken, life in the shadows became the new reality. Not because they chose to hide, but because that was the only place they were left alone. The chains were broken, but their echo never left. Argonians walk the streets of Morrowind today as free people, yet everywhere they go, the past follows them like a shadow. It's in the way others look at them. It's in the names carved into old records, in the cracked stones of the plantations, in the soot left behind on the walls of mines they were forced to dig. Their ancestors bled to raise the cities, laid roads through swamps and ashlands, hauled salt and kwama eggs to markets they couldn't shop in. Now their children walk those same roads and hear the silence where their own stories should be. Their names are rarely taught. Their history is rarely shared. The legacy of slavery lives not only in how the Dunmer remember them, but also in what the Argonians have been forced to forget. Their language, once spoken freely under the branches of the Hist, is now a quiet thing, half remembered. Many young Argonians born in the cities don't speak it at all. The dialects vanish slowly, smothered by centuries of neglect and mockery. In the slave pits, speaking your native tongue could bring punishment. In the cities now, it brings confusion or ridicule. Over time, even those who tried to hold on found themselves slipping into the common tongue, leaving pieces of themselves behind. Their gods too were pulled apart. The Hist, the trees they believe are not just sacred but alive, were seen by the Dunmer as simple plants at best and heresy at worst. Worshipping the Hist in public was forbidden during slavery, and even now it's treated with suspicion. Temples rarely allow shrines to the Hist, and books that try to explain Argonian belief often get it wrong. They frame the Hist as primitive or mystical, without understanding their true place in Argonian identity. As a result, younger Argonians raised in foreign lands often grow up with only fragments of that belief, secondhand stories of the roots they can't see or feel. What makes it worse is that some parts of Argonian culture were taken and reshaped. Some Dunmer scholars and collectors hoarded items and rituals they found exotic, stripping them of meaning and repackaging them for study. Ceremonies once held under the guidance of the Hist were copied without understanding. Artifacts that belonged in Black Marsh ended up behind glass in noble houses. Argonian customs were turned into curiosities, divorced from their origin. That erasure left wounds deeper than scars. It created a sense of being untethered, especially for Argonians born after the fall of slavery who still find themselves surrounded by the ruins of it. They grow up in cities where their people built the foundations but are rarely given credit. They go to markets where they might see an old slave collar for sale as a collector's piece. They pass guards who still treat them like suspects. They try to find pride in who they are while being told again and again that who they were doesn't matter. In schools and temples, they learn Dunmer history. They memorize the names of gods who once stood silent as they were enslaved. Their own heroes and legends are missing from the books. And because so many of their elders were silenced or broken by what they endured, the stories don't always get passed down. So a young Argonian might know the name of Almalexia before they know the name of their own tribal ancestors. They might feel a sense of loss they can't explain, a kind of hollowness that grows when every part of your past has been buried or rewritten. Some do try to reclaim it. In secret gatherings beneath the cities or deep in the marshes, old ways are taught again. Songs are sung. Hist sap is shared. Names once lost are remembered. But it's an uphill climb, made harder by centuries of being told their culture wasn't worth keeping. For many Argonians in Morrowind, life is about carrying the weight of a history they didn't choose. They are told to move on, to forgive, to integrate, but never given the tools to heal. The trauma isn't just emotional, it's generational. Passed down in the stories not told, the songs not sung, the gods not honored. Every time a young Argonian is ignored in court, or left out of a council, or turned away from a guild, the ghost of the past speaks again. It whispers in the silence, in the gaps, in the spaces where a culture should live. And still, they endure. They find ways to carry that legacy with quiet strength, refusing to let it be erased completely. They walk through cities that try to forget them, rooted in a memory that goes deeper than stone. Not all remember the words, not all know the names, but the memory lives in the bones, in the blood, in the silent bond between one survivor and another. And so, even now, the Argonians of Morrowind move through a world shaped by chains they never forged, haunted by a history that still reaches for them with cold fingers. The ghost never left. Slavery may be over in name, but its weight still presses down on every Argonian who walks the streets of Morrowind. Even the ones born long after the chains were broken carry that past in their bones. They live in cities their people helped build but are still treated like outsiders. They speak a language that was once punished out of them. They pray to gods that were mocked or banned. For many, the past isn't just something to study, it's something they live in every day. You can see it in the way they speak. Gel, the language of the Argonians, was once shared from one generation to the next under the shade of the Hist. But in Morrowind, that chain of memory was snapped. In the mines and on the plantations, Argonians were kept apart, watched constantly, and punished for speaking their tongue. So they stopped. They did it to survive. But now, generations later, many young Argonians don't speak Gel at all. Some know a few words, some try to learn it on their own, but for most, it's a missing part of who they are. They grow up with a name and a face, but no words to describe where they come from. And when they do try to learn, there are few left who can teach them. Their gods didn't fare any better. The Hist, the sacred trees that guide Argonian thought and life, were never given respect in Morrowind. The Dunmer called them primitive or dangerous. Worshipping the Hist was forbidden during the years of slavery. Now it's just ignored. You won't find Hist shrines in the temple districts or city centers. You'll find them in the back alleys, in the shadows, in the corners where no one is looking. That tells young Argonians what they need to know. Their faith is something to hide, something not worth space or honor. And when the Dunmer do talk about the Hist, it's often with misunderstanding. They describe the trees like they're beasts, or strange tools, or curiosities. They don't see them the way the Argonians do, as living memory, as family, as home. That gap between how Argonians see themselves and how others see them creates a kind of quiet grief. It's not always loud, it doesn't always burn. Sometimes it's just a hollow feeling, like something important was lost and no one even noticed. The traditions, the dances, the symbols, many of them are gone. Or worse, they've been stolen and changed. Dunmer nobles once collected Argonian art and called it exotic. They took songs and rituals and reshaped them into shows for guests. So even the pieces that survive don't always feel real anymore. They feel like copies. They feel like echoes. For the Argonians, still living in Morrowind, especially in places like Vivec or Narcissus, there's this constant tension between staying silent and trying to reclaim what was taken. Some choose to forget, to move forward, to blend in. Others search for what was lost. They build small shrines. They teach their children old words. They gather in secret to share stories passed down like whispers. But even that comes with risk. In many places, Argonians who speak too loudly about their past are seen as troublemakers. They're told to be grateful, to behave, to forget, and that creates another layer of loss. Not just the loss of culture, but the loss of the right to mourn it. The cities where they live are full of reminders of what they helped build. The bricks and roads came from their labor. The wealth that flows through the markets once flowed through their hands in chains. But there are no statues of Argonians, no public records of their names. No thanks, just silence. And that silence teaches them something too, that their place is to work, to stay quiet, to be part of the backdrop. It's not just about memory, it's about identity. Argonians born in Morrowind grow up with a split sense of self. On one hand, they know this land. They speak the common tongue. They know the streets. On the other, they're treated like they don't belong. They're reminded every day that this place sees them as different, not just foreign, but lesser. That confusion settles in the mind early. It follows them through school, through work, through every part of life. It makes it harder to hold on to pride. It makes it harder to say, I know who I am. Some try to go back to Black Marsh to find answers. Some succeed. Some feel out of place there too. They've been shaped by two worlds and belong fully to neither. And that is the legacy of slavery. Not just the pain of the past, but the damage it did to the future. It took more than labor. It took roots. It took voice. And now, even as Argonians try to rebuild, they're doing it in the shadow of a system that never wanted them to have that chance. Still, they try. They write songs. They paint. They speak Gel to their children. They gather and tell stories of the Hist and the old tribes. Every act of memory is an act of resistance. Every step forward is one taken with the ghost of the past behind them. They haven't forgotten, and that matters. There's a weight that comes with not having a place to belong. For the Argonians still living in Morrowind, that weight never fully lifts. Slavery is gone, but the shadow it left behind still lingers in every corner of their lives. They walk the same streets as everyone else, but they know they aren't seen the same way. They live in cities they helped raise, but no one calls them founders. They exist in a world that calls them free, but it doesn't treat them like equals. And when they look across the border toward Black Marsh, the land of their ancestors doesn't always feel like home either. Many of them were born in Morrowind. It's the only land they've known. They speak the language, know the customs, and understand how to navigate the sharp looks and cold silences. But that knowledge came at a price. In learning to live in Morrowind, they gave up parts of themselves. Their language faded. Their faith was forced into hiding. Their old ways were traded for survival. Now, even if they return to Black Marsh, some feel out of place there too. The Hist still remember them, but not all tribes do. Some see them as changed, shaped by dumber hands, unfamiliar in dress and voice, so they don't quite fit in there either. They're caught between two worlds, never fully accepted in one, never fully welcome in the other. And that leaves many of them stuck in a quiet limbo. They build lives in Morrowind, but those lives are often lived in the margins. They work the jobs no one else wants. They live in the lowest quarters of the cities, tucked away from the main roads and bright markets. They keep their heads down, not out of fear, but because it's easier than being reminded again and again that they're not seen as equals. They try to raise families, to pass down what little of their culture remains, but even that is a challenge. Their children grow up hearing stories of a homeland they've never seen, while learning to survive in a land that doesn't love them. They grow up speaking two names, carrying two sets of memories, always wondering which one truly belongs to them. And the truth is, neither side gives a full answer. In Morrowind, they're still called outsiders. In Black Marsh, they're sometimes seen as strangers. So where do they belong? That's the question that follows every Argonian in exile. The ones who stayed behind after the slave gates opened. The ones who chose not to flee during the Argonian invasions. The ones who live in the ruins of old plantations or work in shops owned by Dunmer they once served. They survive, they adapt, they endure, but they don't always know why they must keep proving they deserve to stay. The treaties that ended slavery didn't erase history. The lines on the map don't heal wounds. Freedom doesn't mean safety, and time doesn't always bring change. Even now, long after the chains were broken, the echoes of that past still shape how Argonians are treated, how they see themselves, and how others see them. They are survivors, yes, but survival came with scars. Not just the ones on their bodies, but the ones in their stories, in the silence where culture should have been, in the gaps left by names forgotten, in the prayers spoken quietly so no one hears. Their story is not just about pain, it's about endurance, about holding on when the world tried to take everything. It's about rebuilding a sense of self out of broken pieces, but it's also about the cost of that strength, because no one should have to be strong just to be treated like a person. No one should have to fight every day just to be seen. And yet, that's still the world Argonians face in Morrowind. They exist in the spaces in between the memory of chains and the promise of freedom, between a homeland that feels distant and a current land that feels cold. They're not just caught between two places. They're caught between two versions of themselves, and no treaty, no law, no passing of time has fully solved that. There are Argonians who try to bridge the gap, who teach the old ways in quiet corners, who paint their scales in the colors of their tribe, who walk proudly, even when they're told not to. They are the future, but even they carry the past, because the past was never buried. It walks with them, it speaks through them, it shapes their steps. And until that past is truly seen, until the stories of slavery and survival are told without shame or silence, the Argonians of Morrowind will keep living in that in-between space. Not quite at home, not quite free, but still here, still standing, still refusing to be erased.